The idea is just to simply start to get a sense of, at the regional level, some of the issues that Stephen identified. And as we go through this presentation, I think you're going to find that there's an absolute sensational level of synergy in terms of the frameworks that he was presenting and some of the ideas that are popping up in the interviews with stakeholders and youth, but also in terms of what's not being spoken about in those contexts. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through some slides very quickly. I've got three main ones that basically distill the findings from this research. And I just call them conversation points, but ultimately some of them will resonate with you, some of them you will kind of shake your head and go, no, that's not Red Deer, but nevertheless, those are the data that are starting to come out of the research at this point. Now, very quickly, youth homeless research, it's growing in the last 5-6 years. Over the last 20 years, we're starting to delve into these ideas a little bit. I like to try and keep things as regional as possible. Realistically, I'm very new to youth homelessness research, about 2.5, 3 years. Homeless research I've been doing for about 10 years. I split my time between casinos, not gambling, but I study casinos, and I study the youth homeless issues. Casinos and that stuff, that gets me tenure. That's the stuff I publish a lot. I rarely publish in this realm. What I do though, is a lot of community-based research endeavors like this. So you'll rarely see my name floating in publications, but you'll see a lot of reports and hopefully hear good things down the line. But nevertheless, from an Alberta perspective, when we took a look at what youth homeless meant within a policy framework, we went back to the plan for Alberta, took a look. It only mentions youth 5 times, albeit within a very proactive context. Work needs to be done. Not dismissive, but hell, we got to move on and get this going. As was suggested earlier, there's going to be a plan released. Has it been released? It's about to be released. Roxana announced its release, so nevertheless, we're somewhat accurate here. We know that we have a better idea of the scope of the issues provincially. And from my perspective, and Steve may or may not agree, but I think it's got to do more with the municipal efforts than anything. This is an issue that at the community level is really being taken to heart here in Alberta, other provinces as well, but I like to tout, what we're doing here because I think we are doing a fantastic job, and we do have a lot of international scrutiny at this point in time. Folks in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, they really know what we're doing, not only in Canada, but specifically here in Alberta, so we really have to take our hats off to ourselves, if you will. But nevertheless, when we started to take a look at what this all means, some data that popped up was absolutely shocking. Youth homelessness, when I took a look at point-in-time counts and various reports that have been published provincially, what we found, my researchers and I, is that 20% homeless in Calgary, that's youth. That's 13 to 25-year-olds, not including couch surfing, as was identified a couple of times this morning so far. Here in Red Deer, 1 in 4 of the homeless population fall into that category of youth. So you can see that this is more than simply anecdotally an issue within the communities. We can statistically point to these issues, and it is quite significant. And my research team and I started to take a look at why this is the case, and really the policy models that we have, that's a very macro sort of thing, but we really don't deal with youth homelessness in a framework that Steve presented this morning, which is as a unique sort of sui generis, right, self-generating sort of concept, right? What we do is we kind of lump it in with how we respond to adult homelessness, and we hope to do our best with those modified models. And ultimately, from here, we can claim that these are very ad hoc in scope, just because youth homelessness shouldn't exist. And really, when you take a look at news reports and so on, it doesn't exist until we start to go down to the regional level and we see the Red Deer, the Gazette or the Advocate? I should know this stuff. Lethbridge Herald, when we take a look at these small regional newspapers, they deal with these issues, but really beyond the pale of those small communities, we really don't see the issue brought up in the national media. Homelessness, yes, but we don't break it down into its constituent elements, right? So what we thought once upon a time, about 1.5 years ago, and what ultimately I'm going to be talking about here, is starting to generate some community-based data. And not simply speaking to stakeholders, but also engaging the youth to get a sense of the problems with the system. Now, I don't think that I'm an innovator in that sense, but not a lot of people do that research. I can only think of a few, including Jeff Carabinow. But really, we don't speak to the youth oftentimes because we still hold those sort of preconceptions about what youth are, 16, 17-year-olds, not fully cognitively cooked at this point, perhaps responsive, reactive, but not thoughtful and insightful. And that's something that I try and balk at, because really, once upon a time, when you were talking about transitional housing, at 17 I was transitioned out of my house by my dad. So I really do have an understanding to a degree over those 3 years that I was kind of floating around as to what some of the kids are going through. As I get older, 30 years ago, I can't remember 30 years ago, but as I get older, I'm a little bit more distant from it. But this sort of research starts to, it helps me kind of draw me back and get a sense of where I came from as well. But nevertheless, what we wanted to do is try and get a sense of what constitutes youth homelessness. Who's experiencing it? What's the scope of the issue? And we'll define scope in a little while here. What services exist that we can address this? How are the youth impacted? How many youth are impacted? And then ultimately we can get to the very important and preventative issues. How do we make improvements to existing service delivery? And ultimately, what are the strategies that we can develop? Now, just very quickly here, the methodology that we're using, we took a look at the literature on youth homelessness. Stephen's book, I read it. Actually, I did read it as part of what I do. That's kind of the center at this moment in time in terms of the consolidated literature that's telling us something substantial. Took a look at a lot of other pieces, but realistically, there's only, I'd say, a good 150 articles out there over the last 15 years that talk about youth homelessness in any sort of substantive way. What we wanted to do is get beyond the literature. We wanted to talk to people. So we decided that we were going to come up here. We were going to participate in interviews with stakeholders, with the youth themselves. The idea being that we were going to develop personal narratives, which is basically we're going to put a transcript together of the interview. We're going to go back and we're going to try and get a sense of, let's say distill it down to 2 pages, how this individual has lived their life over the last 2-3 months, last 2-3 years, so that we can start to bounce these narratives off to show comparisons and ultimately to show where there's divergence in those experiences. To date, we've interviewed 7 youth here. We've interviewed 15 stakeholders, and we've had 3 focus groups, I believe. So we're almost done in terms of the numbers, but the idea now is to go through, code all of the data. We do that using a fancy computer and fancy software. I'll give you an example of how we do this, but ultimately, we go through all of this material with a fine-tooth comb, if you will, for the purposes of trying to come up with a very accurate representation so that we can report back to the community, which is, in this case, you guys. Again, we want to know the scope of the problem. We want to know the demographics. The 2 out of 3 fits here in red here just off the top. Social and economic strata. For the most part, we would classify most of the youth that we've spoken with and the ones in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat as well, because we're doing corresponding studies down there. They all come from what we would call middle class. Now I know there's different strata within those strata, but nevertheless, that's the bulk of the people that we're dealing with in terms of the interviews that we see you guys dealing with in terms of your frontline experiences. Educational background and achievement for the most part. Most don't even have, I think, grade 10 or 11 at this point in time. Some have grade 7 and 8 because they've been experiencing the issues that led them to homelessness as early as 9, 10, 11 years old, right? So what's that, grade 3, 4, 5? I don't have any kids, so you'll have to help me out there. Mental health. One of the things that we were kind of surprised to see in the data here, but everywhere else as well, we see this language of development being utilized to talk about the youth, and really at that moment in time, as soon as we start to apply the idea of developmental, we seem to excise this idea of mental health from the dialogue, not recognizing that, yes, as early as 15 and 16, we start to see episodes of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and so on. So what we found with speaking with the stakeholders is that mental health was only mentioned 1 or 2 times in all of the interviews. We just talked about developing youth with the hopes that they don't have these mental health issues at this point in time. Addictions, which can be manifest through mental health and other issues. We want to know what foster home, group home, and past home experiences were like so that we can start to qualify what's going on. And then ultimately FASD. A really big issue, just period, when we start to take a look at the First Nations community. I'm in Native Studies, so I do a lot of this stuff. That's obviously an issue. And when we talk about mental health, the one thing that not a lot of people recognize is that amongst the First Nations community in Canada, individuals are presenting at 4 times the rate higher than non-Native Canadians in terms of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So when we start talking about First Nations issues, all of a sudden we have to affect even a different lens of understanding. So we wanted to get a sense of whether we can identify the risk factors, right? It's just, the research 101 approach that we take. Do different categories exist, like different taxonomies? When we talk homeless, we tend to blanket the discussion with just the word of homeless, right? Can we start to qualify it in different ways that can help service providers develop their own programs and their response strategies? Do the youth see themselves as homeless? I'd suggest that most of you who work on the front lines will tell me right now that none of the youth that you work with see themselves as homeless. And I had a talk with Franklin and Roxana a few weeks ago, and it was absolutely shocking, I think, when we started to banter back and forth at how attuned these kids can be in terms of working with frontline workers and how perceptive they can be to say, well, that person's just doing it because it's a job. That person really feels for me, and that they can't perceive that they're actually homeless at that moment in time. The cognitive dissonance at that moment is just amazing. What are the mechanisms that they employ, the resiliency that they utilize to remain in a fairly safe and stable homeless state? And we want to take a look at that as well. So ultimately, those were the main questions that we asked. But what I want to do is I want to present some of the ideas that have popped up. Now again, as an outsider coming into the community, it's a very tenuous situation for me because it's very, I put myself out there in a position of open to critique in a big way. Well, you don't live here, you don't know the social dynamics and so on. And I agree, so I try and frame these ideas in as positive and sensitive a manner as possible. Yet at the same time, I think it's really important for an outside set of eyes to come in and take a look at what's going on with those ideas in mind for the purposes of presenting some new ideas that perhaps weren't thought of or were discounted as perhaps not important that should be given a little bit more gravity at this stage of the game. So what we're going to see here are just some of the ideas that have popped up in the interviews that we've had with the youth and the stakeholders. This is all evidence-generated, ideas at this point in time. Things that the youth would like to see affected, stuff that stakeholders see as difficulties and barriers in doing their job properly, but ultimately just stuff to get the conversation going more than anything. We heard this earlier, and you're going to hear a lot of repetition, what I'm going to present in terms of what Steve has already presented. Align and simplify agency intake instruments to ensure commonality of not only the experience, so youth don't have to go through 16 different intakes, but ultimately establishing a common data set from which people can start to work from. The one thing that we found most of the stakeholders were averse to was data. And I'm not really sure what the issue is there in terms of, does it take too much time to collect it? Do we not have the expertise to crunch it? Is the fluidity of the job and the environment that you're working with and the youth themselves, is there deemed no real need for the data at this point in time? To establish these common data sets is an effective tracking mechanism, and establishing intake instruments that can be fed into a common computer, if you will, that everybody can access outside of FOIP if we can. It really gives us an idea of what's going on at the ground level. That was something that came from the youth themselves because they're tired of sitting through all of the intake and they don't want to be in the system anymore if they have to go through the 5th or the 6th or the 9th interview. Systems approach with a key agency or individual. What we heard from most people, and I've got a slide of some of the codes just to give you a sense later, is that there's really no sort of catalytic agency or individual in town or group of individuals that kind of acts as the hub. Now that may or may not be true because I know that there's lots of committees and I know there's lots of individuals that network with one another, but ultimately like social housing in action in Lethbridge, which becomes kind of the clearinghouse for all discussion on homeless issues within Lethbridge, and Diane Randall, who's just a control freak. If you no, okay. Well, if you knew Diane, you'd be laughing at that. So, but she's the one who kind of centers the dialogue, and in one way, it can be an incredibly effective mechanism. In another way, you can kind of shut out discussion and new information. But nevertheless, it's worked extremely well in Lethbridge, and it's something that we found most folks were not averse to, but it really didn't come up in discussion. And when systems were brought up, usually we found the funding competition issue took precedence. How are we supposed to survive if we network and we align and ultimately money goes to another agency that we can't get to ensure our operations? Mental health concerns, that was a big one. Only 2 people that worked on the front line mentioned mental health in any way. What we found is that most people took that typical approach. Youth are just little adults, and all we have to do is kind of direct them to the right agency, pat them on the butt, and everything's going to work out because they're eventually going to grow out of this. the lack of attention devoted to mental health concerns is a concern in this context because, you know, as early as 9 and 10 years old, even though kids are still developing at that stage, these issues do become a reality.